of the audio, because the last couple of lectures, the audio is barely, you can barely make it out. Okay, so let's dive into today's agenda. I want to do this, the title for this is By the Numbers, and we will do some calculations on the board as well. But how many of you have previously been introduced to Fermi's problems? Do you all, in any classes before, or you've heard the idea of back of the envelope calculations, right? So one thing we're going to do is, this is a very common tradition in physics, and we're going to apply that idea to a broad context of social sciences, but also how do you really evaluate the ideas that you're starting to think about. And so I'll cover a little bit of a history. We'll choose one or two examples, but after that it would be really fun to dive in for at least 20 minutes or so of this class, where we will actually do some number crunching on a piece of paper, and then we'll come back and essentially discuss what that means. This is a very valuable skill. It seems like it's trivial that you can just read about it. It's very difficult to embody as a skill unless you practice. And I'll show you a few sets of examples that when you read other people's back of the envelope numbers, it's very simple. But there's a problem that I've been working on, and I actually lost my notes. So I'm going to try to recreate that from 2 years ago from vague memory, and you'll see how hard it is when you're trying to get to a specific kind of an idea. So this is all about practice, and so you have to really try to practice this skill. It's valuable to do it early on, so you really understand that the problem that you chose has meat. It is truly the problem that you're excited about, and then you can go back and use those same sets of statistics to also convince other people. Okay, so I think, how do I advance slides? Is that here or over there?
It should be there.
Oh, it's on that? No, I don't see it. Oh.
Sorry. Where are we here?
I see. This is linked to, yeah, there are three of them. No.
Yeah.
Okay. So, in the context of Frugal, it doesn't get more frugal than pencil and paper. And the thread that we'll try to cover is to just historically, I don't know how many of you have read this quote before, but I'll just read it and see if you can identify who wrote this. I often say that when you can measure what you're speaking about and express it in numbers, you know something about it. But when you cannot measure it, when you cannot express it in numbers, your knowledge is of a meager and unsatisfactory kind. It may be the beginning of knowledge, but you have scarcely in your thoughts advanced to the state of science, whatever the matter may be. Does this remind? This is a very famous quote. You want to guess how old it is? Who might have said it? So this is Lord Kelvin, and this is 1883. This is around the time people were trying to decipher and figure out that charge is a thing. This is when people could sense certain sets of phenomena, but it was not really clear what is the quantity of charge. And I think this is a theme that has played out in many fields, although really early on, physics picked on this notion, and physics became very quantitative. And that has happened, almost 100 years later. Now when you think about biology, it's almost impossible to think about biology without the context of numbers. And at that same time, many fields in global health and many of the, climate change is sort of an outpost of a field that came out of physical oceanography, atmospheric sciences. They're extremely quantitative. And so I think it would be very valuable for thinking about in terms of what can we learn from tricks that have worked well in the history in sciences, but then also apply them to fields where it's much harder to experimentally validate your ideas. So this is the first example that I would say. It's probably the most famous example. Does anybody recognize this map? Yes. Cholera? Yeah. So this is the very first example of what can be called as data journalism. This is 1854, and this is John Snow's map of trying to identify the Broadway pump. And I'll just show you the link to this. If actually, because I'm not connected through my computer, I probably, is there a browser here as well? This is online, right?
Yeah.
So how do I, but then this doesn't project to that, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, that's gonna be okay. We'll deal with this. How should we deal with that? Because there is a point of time I was gonna. Oh, it only records and only projects PowerPoints.
I think so. Yeah.
I see. I see.
It might be yeah.
One option is we could shift to I don't know if this PowerPoint's available somewhere. If we shift to my laptop, then we could probably do both.
How would we do that?
I don't know. Actually, I don't know if you made it.
No, I have on my laptop both the PowerPoint and everything, but it won't record the same way that you're thinking about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We'd have to get that set up on
Yeah.
your computer.
Okay. I'll just talk through it, and I think at some point of time we will switch.
Okay.
Because I was going to go through some of the numbers, but we can have people use their laptops for that time. Maybe the background for this is if folks haven't actually, in the context of pandemics, it's very valuable. But one thing that you should just all do is go through the background of what actually happened. There's a beautiful video from Harvard X that really talks about both the history of the Jon Snow pub, but also how this data was actually collected. And one lesson to take away from something like this was it was primarily data, and this is the first evidence of very quantitative epidemiology that you could do, that led to identifying potentially that there was a pump and an infected water source. But you have to understand, this is happening at a time where we did not know that cholera is actually spread by water. So it's not so intuitive if you are in that context to say that you would actually pinpoint and think about this water source. And of course, the famous incidence is that the handle for this pump was removed, and that led to the pandemic to die down, showing and demonstrating effectively that this source was there, although at that time it was not as if you could actually test that water for cholera. And historically, it's an incredible marker in terms of thinking about even for ideas where very little evidence exists, where you are still grappling with what the reality might be, just purely focus on collecting some background data still helps. So this is not in the sense where somebody had a theory and then you went out and essentially proved it. It's almost to an extent that this data gathering as an exercise was actually really valuable in the conjectures that people were thinking about. And so I think for many of the projects that you're thinking, it will become very valuable to be collecting data that is relevant even if you don't know how you will actually use it. So another similar example from an historical context that I really like is the notions of do atoms exist? So this is also happening around the same time, and this played out all the way till the 1950s, where you have this very conceptual idea that atoms were very useful as a mathematical model. You could say that you could calculate heat capacity, you could calculate many properties of thermodynamics. And one of the things that I love in this perspective was all the sets of players that are involved. There were equal players championing the idea that atoms are actually real, and other sets of players that were championing that, yes, conceptually this is a good idea, but can you show it to me? And of course, have all of you seen the movie by IBM, the atom, the boy that made atom, or something along those lines? Anyway, you can visualize atoms now, right? There are plenty of microscopes that you can actually see literally atoms, but that wasn't possible at that time. And in that same framework, one thing that's actually really valuable is to think about what do you do when you only have indirect measurements. And this is Jean Perrin's book, which is really titled Around the Reality of Atoms. And he got a Nobel Prize for this work. And one of the things that is fascinating is you calculate the same thing that you're trying to calculate. In this scenario, it happens to be the Avogadro number, by literally 10 different methods. So what you're looking at in that table is essentially 10 completely independent mechanisms, all the way from how blue the sky is to viscosity of gases to Brownian motion that's shown in here. And look at those numbers. So these are all estimates of the Avogadro number. And this is multiplied by 10 to the power 23. And you can 10 to the power 22. And you can see how close those numbers are. And one of the things that he writes in his book is, our wonder is aroused at the very remarkable agreement found between values derived from the consideration of such widely different phenomena. Seeing that not only it is the same magnitude obtained by each method, and one of the things that he's trying to point out is use this as an analogy that if you could calculate the same thing but with completely independent ways, there is another set of a validation in the lack of the fact that you can actually observe it. So this is another practice or a trick to play in when you are exploring these ideas of order of magnitude numbers, is try using completely different assumptions and see whether you arrive at similar sets of numbers. And so because every single time when you will do these sets of calculations, it's going to be very important that you challenge your assumptions. Because, of course, if you don't, you can fool yourself very easily into falling into a situation where you're orders of magnitude off. And I think one of the other things to be, which comes from the history of physics per se, it's actually comes from cosmology, is that order of magnitude, so 10 times less or more doesn't really matter so much when you're trying to grasp something where you have absolutely no intuition for. And we'll do some of those examples to make it very concrete. So it is not the accuracy that we are looking for, but when you do use multiple methods and they start converging or diverging, it is a hint that you might be on the right path. Okay, so let's jump to some sets of examples. And of course, I'm choosing things that have a lot of historical context. So there is a lot that's written about the reality of atoms, and then there is a lot that exists on the history of John Snow's work. And you could argue that it was the first quantitative work in public health, in the sense that, of course, all of you have every day on the news, you see total number of deaths, total number of cases. That doesn't just come randomly. It comes from the history of epidemiology, where we have a strong belief that if you cannot quantify a problem, you cannot begin to actually dismantle it or understand it. All the way to some very complex problems like racism, or problems that might be around the justice system in the country. Unless you can put numbers to that, it becomes very difficult to convince other people, and it also becomes very difficult to you yourself to think about whether you are taking the right approach or not. And I think we'll use that. Climate change is a great example where we'll talk a little bit about this. Is milk as bad as beef? You've all read The Cost of a Hamburger, but you should start thinking about how would you evaluate and compare whether is milk okay or not. Okay, so another context to this quantification. I'll let you guys guess who said this. In after years, I've deeply regretted that I did not proceed far enough, at least to understand something of the great leading principles of mathematics, for men, women, thus endowed, seem to have an extra sense. Does anybody want to guess who said that? So this is Darwin. It was the end of his life. He was realizing, and this is also the era of quantitative biology now when we look at it, that he understood there was no field of theoretical biology at that time. There was no context of thinking about mathematical life sciences. But he was just starting to realize the fact that there is something that's missing in his work. when he compares that to things that he has read. This is Ron and Rob, two just remarkable individuals. One of them is the author of Physical Biology of the Cell, and then they've written a book together called Cell Biology by the Numbers. It's an absolutely fantastic book, and it's almost become essentially a must-have for most biologists on their table. And the principle of the book is actually very simple. And so maybe what I'll ask you guys to all do is open your laptops and go to this website, which is called Biology by the Numbers. And we're going to try to do a quick query, but just wait for a second before you do the query. One of the beautiful aspects of this is some of these numbers have to be experimentally validated. Some of them have to be estimated from other numbers that have been validated. And what you will go through is see a massive database. If you want to know how large an E. coli is or a yeast cell is, what is the size of water molecule, how many water molecules might be present on this planet, you need that number to be able to decipher how much water is actually here. There is also the context of, I'm just talking about size, you can talk about mass, you can talk about time, how fast do certain processes happen. For example, degradation, if you're interested, which we will talk about a little bit, as how fast does plastic degrade. So you need to ask yourself, what sets of time parameters should I be thinking about? So open your laptops and go to this site. It's called book.bionumbers.org or bionumbers. And then there is a search bar there. And then you can take a moment before you type. Think of anything that you want to know in the context of biological sciences. What might you want to know today? And the more original the question is, the more fun the answer is going to be. And then we will recapture that question that you might not directly be able to get an answer for that. And then we will go back and learn the Fermi's principles of how to break that into many number of pieces to get to that answer. So this primarily acts as a massive database, but I'm just curious, if you were to ask to type something in it, I'm curious, what are you going to type? Anybody who's ready, just type your thing, and then you can also shout out what you're searching for. Yeah, I'll wait. What do you want to know if there was any number that you wanted or cared about? And you can already start thinking about, I was talking to a few students already about projects. You can already start connecting it with projects that you're passionate about. But it doesn't have to be that. I think this is much more of a practice. So, yes? No, it's a type of a process. It's something, eventually every question can be quantified. So in some sense, you can still break that down further, but you could start with an open question and then eventually think about, okay, what number might allow me to answer that question?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so I feel like right now I've heard a lot about skin microbiome.
Yes?
Specifically on your foot, how long would it take a newly introduced microorganism to become the majority on your foot?
Uh-huh. So skin microbiome. And what you're even further interested in is a takeover, for example, where if a species is introduced, you're interested in time, which is how long for becoming majority. So now, with that question in mind, what should you type in? What do you think? It would be interesting if you typed in that exact same question and it popped out the answer. Science doesn't work that way. So what would you want to know as some basic parameters for a question like that? I want to know the surface area of my leg, or the very basic, simple geometry. That's something that we can figure out. You definitely need to know the size of a bacteria or a microbe, just so you know what the niche is. What are the other things that come to mind that you might want to search? And you should just try searching some of those things to also see how extensive that database is in the context of microbiomes. We'll come back to this question in a second. Other ideas, they can be totally random. I think it doesn't have to be very purposeful. as I was mentioning, this is about practice. So we should come up with as many crazy things that people want to know. Any COVID-related questions you might have? There's actually a whole section on COVID by the numbers that was done really beautifully. Michael? No.
It's specifically biology, right? So we're looking at...
Yeah, I think I'm using biology as an example because biology is a great place where you can't do a first principles calculation and arrive at certain ideas, so you really have to depend on certain kinds of data, certain types of experiments. So it's a great place to start, but you can come up with something else, yeah.
Can I ask, is the rate of internal infections increasing or decreasing once a person is infected?
And so do you mean in the context of COVID?
Right, yeah.
Okay, so rate of...
It could be an influenza, malaria...
Yeah, so rate of infection. So that's actually a very interesting question. Suddenly you pointed out that, okay, there will be certain diseases, so I need to think about this should not be a universal process. And then you already listed that, oh, am I interested in humans? Am I interested in gorillas? That would also change in some sense, but there might be certain universalities. And so if we choose a tissue type, and you can also just think about, this is a complex question because it's not a bacterial culture that exponentially grows and crashes. The system is responding to it as well, so I need to know and understand a little bit about the system itself. Let's search for this for around lungs. So you could just first start with, in COVID, in the context of lungs, what do we know so far? So you could try certain sets of queries. You could, for example, initially start asking, how many particles are there in the lung as a unit of time? How does that change as COVID progresses? And then, of course, you can backtrack in what you understand from the lung to possibly try to evaluate this for totally other sets of parameters. So these are very biomedical. I'm curious, people have other just puzzles that, keep you up at night, anything you want to figure out. I mean, I want to know how many hair I have on my head, so that would be useful. How would I start that if I want to figure that out? So that's an easy one, right? Yeah. Oh, go ahead. Number of hair follicles per unit area. And so this somebody must have measured it. And then you can actually then start comparing between species. I don't know if you guys know this number for sea otters. It's an insane number of 1 million hair follicles per, yeah.
I just went on a kayaking thing about sea otters.
Yeah.
And they said in 1 square inch, a sea otter has as many hairs as an entire golden retriever.
Yeah, and see, that's comes as a nice surprising, but unless you would say this, you won't look at sea otter the same way, right? And there is also, then you can ask yourself why that is. But it's very important to be able to put a number to that. And I think, the number is absurd, like 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter might have 1 million hair follicles or something.
That's what my kayak tour guide said.
Yeah. Okay, so we went to hair. Other sets of ideas, you could just do a quick search and see what it gave you in the query itself. I'm actually curious how in depth it is in terms of when you start typing really things outside cell. I mean, this is really designed as a database on cell and molecular biology, so it's very limited. And I think one thread that I'm trying to emphasize here is that much more number of these types of things need to exist if we are going to teach sustainability from a materials point of view, which we'll talk about in a second, and the education around that. I mean, this is not just about, oh, this is helpful for what you're trying to do, but it is also about our perception of this world, like how many Coke bottles are opened per day, for example. And we can talk about that. We can think about how you're going to arrive to that question. Because if you're going to work on aluminum repurposing and recycling, you better understand this perspective of how large this problem actually is. Which is the challenge when a whole bunch of laws got made, although straws are bad, plastic straws, then people did the numbers, and it was a very small portion, and we can all feel good that we have banned plastic straws, realizing we haven't actually caused any change in our policy per se. So this is really why this is extremely important, because then you have to not just have tools in your hands, but also to be able to convince others that the approach that you're taking is actually relevant. Any other examples before I'm going to move on to kind of doing some of these numbers? Anybody else has a curiosity that you typed in and you got something relevant? Yeah?
I was curious how COVID causes taste loss, but I couldn't find anything on taste buds.
Say that again?
I was curious how COVID causes taste loss, but I couldn't find anything.
Taste loss.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I couldn't find anything on taste buds, though.
Yeah. So if you just type density of taste buds and I think one of the threads, this is a fairly small database, but then you know what to look for. And again, I think the thread there would be is we know, for example, people have thought about throat swabs and tongue swabs as a way for diagnostics. So there might exist a number already around how many COVID particles in a swab that might exist. Because I know, so just speaking of COVID, what they also did is they released this COVID by the numbers. It's a really fun kind of a scenario. It tells you every little thing. It compares it, for example, to sequence commonalities. It compares with just the replication time, literally 10 minutes into entry into the cell. The burst size, every single cell is making 1,000 viruses. That's relevant to the number that you're interested in. This is going to set the infection rate. If this was an order of magnitude higher, this entire thing would explode and would be very different. If you think about this, and in terms of the size of the particle, this is all relevant to how masks should work, how you should really be thinking about masks per se. And you can go on and on in terms of using, evolution rate. That's a fantastic number to have a handle on, because this sets all our variants that are coming out. And I think, in general nomenclature, although tons of people talk about variants, most of the evolutionary biologists had already figured out that this is going to happen, because it is a fast, at the number, even if this number is slow and you let the infection run unchecked, you should be able to back calculate to say what is the probability that a single person in a population, a large set of a population, will actually give rise to a variant. And then they keep on going in terms of just, this is one example of this, but this is related in terms of how a person recovers. That's also related to some of the numbers that Michael was asking about host cells, how often they are found. I'm sure many of you have heard about this fantastic discovery that we made during COVID, that wastewater is an incredible resource for us to be tracking. All of that comes from the fact that there's plenty of particles in stool, because if that was not the case, which is not true for all viruses, you wouldn't be in a position. So if I was to ask you as a homework, is to figure out in a city how much water you need to collect and process from a wastewater perspective to give you a realistic estimate of the number of people that might be infected. Or if you're, because, if I randomly went and just did a spot check of a tiny volume of water, which is in the sewage, you should be able to work backwards from that to really figure out what types of infrastructure do I actually need. And this was one of the key insights when people started doing wastewater, is that this RNA is incredibly abundant. Because for many other problems in the past, the abundance was low and you could not use wastewater. But it turns out, because the abundance is high, you actually really have a reasonable shot in tracking something like this.
Can you repeat that point?
So if you think about this in the context of the amount of sewage and the amount of wastewater that a city collects, a city is very large. Why is it that our tracking of wastewater is actually so sensitive? To a point right now, you can look in the city of Boston and tell what the numbers are doing, and then go back, and a few days or months, a day or a week later, you can see that same trend happen in people, because people show up at a much later stage into the healthcare system. So our tracking of humans is delayed as compared to wastewater. You can really pick up. Wastewater is also, it homogenizes the samples coming in. So every single sample technically counts if you know how to sample correctly. And the other aspect of that is this is the concentration in stool, and although it's lower than, actually it's the same order of magnitude as in the throat and in the nasopharyngeal swab, which is a huge surprise at that time because we did not know that respiratory viruses also show up in the gut. And for COVID, it turns out that is a very strong case, and hence this was a really good strategy.
So the idea here was that we would be able to leverage tracking our water sewage system to know what is the expected number of infected people next week.
Yeah, what I meant to say is this is already happening.
Yeah.
And in COVID, for the first time, we did pandemic tracking by tracking wastewater. An incredibly powerful idea. Lots of companies came about. It's also quite cost effective to implement because there is no logistics of clinical permissions for samples. You're not going hand to hand. Everybody is providing samples to the wastewater service. Secondly, there is this context of if you can uniformly sample, you are reaching all communities. Sometimes certain sets of communities are more open. When we do surveillance and strategies, people may or may not be interested in engaging in a public health strategy. And so, but in this scenario, you could really do this broadly. And this is to an extent that certain sets of countries are really thinking about this being a continuous protocol for some specific, for COVID, it makes a lot of sense. There's all kinds of other issues around thinking about what other information might be floating in the wastewater. But on the other hand, this has really become a fantastic strategy. There are a couple of companies, one of them I'm trying to remember is the BioBot, or a couple entities are already doing this. Yeah, so I think this was somebody staring at these numbers and having an aha moment. So that led to an idea which would not have existed unless you quantitatively think about it. Okay, so I think what we'll try to do now is let's actually choose any specific sort of a question. And I think one thread we could do is you could choose questions about projects that you might be thinking about. I just want you to state a question openly because then when we go in, I'll reference to those as an examples of what we will try to choose. So, this is also a prelude in terms of the logistics of thinking about projects. So as everybody knows, this is a project class. Your grade primarily depends on your project. Projects are all team projects. They can be all the way from one person just working independently to a group of 5 or 6 where a few sets of people are the global community, a few sets of people are local. Will give you extreme flexibility. But I'm assuming if you got interested in this class, there must be issues that you deeply care about. So choose one of those and try to pose a question that's relevant to it, so that I'll just make a list of those and then we will go through a few more examples. I want to cover a little bit about how to do this in the context of climate change and how to do this in the context of global health. But before I do, I don't want to taint and bias because sometimes we ask questions based on the kinds of data sets and resources we have. So before we do that, it would be really fun for just people some of you might have really well-formed ideas. I know I'm not seeing a student, I'll just use that as an example. She's very interested in polio, and especially the context of thinking about not the people. We have done a lot of work to make sure that people don't get polio, but what about the people that already got polio? And so it's an obvious thing to ask, where is polio? What are the total numbers of how many people are currently living with the types of disabilities that get associated with polio in the adult population? Then you might want to stratify it to say, are there any gender contexts to it? And if you're really thinking about prosthetics as an example to that, you might want to try to understand this. So, what is the average weight of a prosthetics? How does that compare to prosthetics for non-polio related problems? You can start asking questions about, okay, how much cost is an average cost of a type of a prosthetic that you would wear that is very specifically designed for a polio patient. So that's just one example, but I'm curious if there are certain sets and threads or interest, do things jump to your mind? And I think you don't have to have a series of these immediately, but we can break those down into specific questions, because what I want to do for the class is to make sure we actually do some math and some numbers. So anybody wants to pitch? Yeah, go ahead, Michael. Yeah, this is also, these conversations are also a great way to recruit team members to your ideas. So feel free to talk, because I think this is also where people with common interest will come together, because otherwise nobody in the class would know that you're interested in something. Yes?
One thing that caught my attention was reading earlier that in Ethiopia there's a huge drought issue.
Mm-hmm.
And in just the last year, over 1.5 million animals, large herd animals,
Uh-huh.
died because of the lack of drinking water.
Mm-hmm.
And you have about 15 million people that don't have any access to water right now, where they pretty much abandoned their cities and their homes to transfer themselves to the north of Africa to try and get water. And this has geopolitical implications, different tribes clashing, but I'm curious to understand better what's happening. What is this drought?
Yeah.
How do we anticipate? What do we do?
Uh-huh. So let's use that as an example in terms of thinking about what types of, and I'll talk quite a lot about what to trust as well. And this is also the whole idea of multiple sources, because sometimes what happened in COVID as well, which there's great examples from many places. But let's just break that down now. So you mentioned number of people displaced. What types of things you might want to know about, say, a country? I know you already mentioned Ethiopia as an example. What types of numbers would you look for example, when you begin? Or what types of calculations we might do indirectly? So clearly the water, understanding the total population is very helpful. What else? And then anybody can shout out. I think this is just, we're just going to build a little bit of a list to see what are some basic things that we should figure out before we even understand this question. Yeah?
Maybe the degree of drought that we have, so rainfall per year.
Uh-huh, rainfall per year.
Model that over history, over 3 years.
You have to do that over time, so that's a good one. So a little bit of patterns around that as well, so you know there is a seasonality. Yeah? Water usage, exactly. So consumption is on the side. Okay. And then you could do this per household. You could also break this down in a much more complex way to see that different households have completely different needs. So there might be sort of multiple tiers associated with this that help you understand. The city versus rural would be a great way. That is the drought situation really a stressful thing with density? Is it an urban issue? So we'll write that as urban versus rural. Okay, let's keep going. There are hundreds of questions that should be going through your mind right now if you're going to tackle this issue. Yeah?
Future predictions.
Uh-huh. How does climate context come about? How do I really think about a year from now? So what might you want to know to incorporate future predictions? The sources becomes very valuable, because immediately the moment you mention sources, I know for Africa there is a political context to this. You know, if you are considering Nile, and Nile cuts through many countries, there are these disputes around countries shutting down a certain amount of water. So there is a political context to that as well. What else?
Population density in the affected region where the drought is.
So I'll write that as well, displaced, and then population density.
Also expected population growth.
Population growth, that's a fantastic one in terms of connected to the future predictions. Okay, let's keep going. So I think the idea is here to really consume your thoughts, because the more, it's perfectly okay that you cannot reach everything, but it's valuable to start with a very broad base. Yeah?
Average resources per household.
And then how are you thinking about resources will plug in which way?
Just
Why does resources matter?
mainly money.
Yeah.
So how
Yeah.
much money does every
Yeah. So the assumption there is that there is a cost to a given resource, and then so average resources, and this is associated with that there has to be a certain price point at which water should be accessible to people. Like, what does that mean? Is water free? As a country, you can say, as a policy, water is a human right, water should be free. That's not the case. I mean, that is not the case throughout the world currently. And so you might say, at the least, there should be this minimum amount of cost if there is a cost associated with new sources. Yes?
Geographically access to sources and then moving water.
Yeah, so now suddenly we have moved into a slightly, we are starting to talk about dynamics, and then we have introduced spatio-temporal dynamics. And suddenly what becomes valuable is that you could fool yourself doing a number for one town and then go back and do the number for the second town and suddenly realize that you were mistaken because of this fact that one had access geographically versus not. So that induces in your head the idea of averages, that you should do this for a few cities to convince yourself that you're on the right approach. So I'm going to just kind of spatial dynamics and geography gets into this already. Okay, anything else that comes to mind? Yes? Quality of water, that is fantastic. So you can see how much fun this can be if you start realizing that all these little ideas and how valuable it is to do this as a group. And these types of brainstorming exercises are really valuable to cast a broad net. So we're going to talk about quality of water here. Again, going back, this is a huge issue. How do you measure quality of water? Like, do we have a water index? Do all countries have a way to say that, okay, out of this tap comes out of a water that has a certain set of a quality? Is that a binary thread that you should not drink from this source and you should drink from this source? So quality of water has, how do you actually even quantify this carefully? Any other ideas?
I would
Yeah.
suggest to consider issues of power
Mm-hmm.
and ownership and hierarchies.
Uh-huh. So how would you quantify it? I see where you're going. What would you look for example?
I know I want to hear from you.
Yeah. So when you say power, I think what you're also referring to is this idea that there can be a source, but it's not accessible to everyone. And
tribal power,
Mhm.
Leadership, and corruption, if you put it into it.
So, most of you know this, right? If you read through the history of famines, many famines are actually caused by mismanagement and not by actual lack of availability. The Great Famine in India was a making of the East India Company per se, and you can start thinking about that context of corruption and understanding that what looks like a drought has human mistakes imprinted in all over. I think the other assumption that we are making, and this is where context become very important, and this is why you have to really do this exercise carefully. You could just sit and assume that all water is actually available, and as you just pointed out, if there is a water source, we assume this whole idea of a public water system, that water as a context of a public resource, but if a well or a given set of an access is in a private hand, does that change the demographics for what will be available? Has that already been happening if you think about the industrial resources that consume a ton of water? And this has been a classic case that has been talked about in many major cities in India, for example, where an entity will take on a water source because they need it for an industrial application and deprive a given group of water. The same goes on if you think about manufacturing for semiconductors, for example, that most countries that have semiconductor manufacturing is a huge fight between who owns the water because they need that water. So I think that's where I would start thinking about ownership as you described. and is there a way to include ownership in your calculations? So the point of this exercise was that this is really infinite, and this is supposed to be, if you're truly passionate about a question, this should be an endless list that you're curating. This is not something that you do in one go and you say, I'm satisfied. You approach the same question and the same sets of ideas with as many lenses as possible, and then you might start seeing some sense of a convergence if you're doing the right thing. And then, of course, there's a massive amount of data that we are relying on, and I'll show you some resources that I really like and enjoy. Some of that is the actual data is always hard to find, and there are certain sets of aggregation sites and services that you can much more easily use, but it's actually very valuable before biasing yourself to what is available, because it's very easy. The whole point of this exercise was, now I'll go and show you some of the resources. It's very easy in these Fermi problems and in general in estimation problems to bias your thinking based on what is available. So if you're given 10 numbers and I tell you to estimate something, then you will just think about those parameters and you won't go outside the bound, like thinking about corruption, thinking about this spatial variation. So it's valuable as you're thinking about the sets of projects that you should read about those issues, but you should also just back of the envelope start thinking about what would be your dream sets of resources that you would like to gather. And literally for every single problem, there needs to be a sheet. And I think just as a homework assignment for this week, what we will do is all of us will just create these types of sheets. They don't have to be complete, they don't have to be right, but it's very important for it to be yours. This will reflect your direct interest. And so some of them can be very technical, some of them can be very social. They can have the mixture of the two if you care about. You can start already anticipating a solution. Like, fog capture. Is fog capture even relevant to Ethiopia? And then you could map and say, the amount of area that's associated with where there is a certain density is just so low, this as a solution should not even be discussed. And as an assignment, I'll give this to people, is I like doing this on the side just for the fun of it, but also it scares me a lot. There is tons of VC interest right now in carbon capture. And you can read the sets of proposals and you do back of the envelope calculations and the math doesn't add up. And you then scratch your head, and this is kind of one of the scenarios that came out in the current IPCC report, is that we have to really tackle about also adding realism to the kinds of solutions that you might be thinking about. So the same set that we did for the problem, you also have to apply these sets of calculations for the solution side of the story, which we'll do that a little bit later. Okay, so let's go through, cover a few climate examples and some things that have been really remarkable only because of this process, and then we'll come back. I think maybe we'll discuss this. If somebody else also has a question in mind, we might be able to get to it and do another one of these exercises. Now you see how useful it is to pick up everybody's brain, so it is useful to share the problem that you might be thinking about. Okay, but let's just do some numbers associated with, I think on the biological context there is a lot of stuff on that. Let's just jump to a little bit on the climate side. So this is a question that is just absolutely beautiful. There's a paper that came out in 2020 from Ron Milo's lab himself. But what was so beautiful about this question was just how they posed it. So as a society, we create stuff. We value ourselves because we create stuff. And the question is, have we created enough stuff that it is larger than the living biomass? So what is greater? Is life on the planet on one side of the scale heavier, quite literally, than the stuff that humans have created? So, before we dive in, I'm just curious, what do people think? Have we created more stuff than the entire biomass on the planet? Or, so maybe the yes and the no people, so the yes people can raise their hands. So I see 2, 3 hands, 4 hands, 5. What about the no people? Remember all the trees and all the elephants and all the ants and all the bacteria and all the viruses. Okay, I see the class is split 50-50, which is actually very interesting because the answer...
Including all the water in the sea?
We don't create the water, so I think that's out.
No, but is the water in the anthropogenic mass?
No, anthropogenic mass is like every possible plastic, every possible factory, every building, concrete.
It's the living biomass?
And that's the living biomass. That'll...
Change to the living biomass.
Oh, you're going to switch to the living biomass.
Water is included,
Yeah. Water is not included in either.
So I go back to the...
Okay. Yes, the water is not included in the either. I'm not talking about the weight of the biomass. So not the oxygen molecules in the atmosphere, no. Just how much life we have on this planet. Like, if you were to weigh every one of the trees that's in the Amazon and every duck and every bird. It's fascinating that you guys are kind of split. Because the answer, which came as a huge shock to the scientific community itself, is 2020 happens to be the crossover point. So both of the teams are right. We are at equal at this point, which is really scary to think about. That, I mean, of course, everybody's been talking about Anthropocene. We have modified our climate in many different ways, but this is literally the moment where humanity reaches almost exactly equal, which is around 1.1 teratons. And we'll kind of dive through this. This is a really fun paper. It's a very easy paper to read. But you should read the methods of a paper like this because it'll give you a context of how to rigorously do this. So, they do a whole bunch of series on Monte Carlo simulations. On one of the lab sessions, I can walk through a little bit of why averaging is important, why checking your resources are important. So this is just a really fun paper that people should read to just give you the power. And what's powerful is they started with a question and they accidentally discovered a really important way of thinking about this because primarily the slopes that you look are what are scary. So first of all, to answer that question, they had to do 5 years ago, they had actually just published a paper which is, how can you answer this if I don't even know what lives on our planet? So they did the living biomass estimate around 2017 or 2016. And they also came through a really fun finding. So I'm listing a whole bunch of random things here. There are humans on this planet, there are fish, there are all the cows, there are viruses. So this is all just the living things, bacteria, fungi, arthropods are all the insects. So the question is, maybe we can just go through, you could pick the most abundant thing in the living biomass. It's not by number. It's by mass. So just what comes to mind when people think about how many people think bacteria are the most abundant thing on this planet, even by mass? So I see the microbiologists in the room, so that's 2 people. What about humans are the most abundant? Nobody thinks that. What about livestock? Nobody. All the cows? No. All the chicken? Okay. Viruses. Viruses, 1 person. Archaea. Okay. Fungi. Insects. Nobody. There's nobody in the insects team. Plants. Okay. I see half the room for plants. And then protists. So a couple of people are split, but the rest of the team is on team plants. So that is actually the right answer. But it's a right answer by orders of magnitude. Just this entire thing is a tiny box here, and this is the entire biomass. So we live on a planet filled with plants, just from a mass perspective. And this is actually significantly reduced from where we started when we started cutting and deforestation and all that. But actually, the second thing that I find much puzzling and surprising, which I had not anticipated, bacteria are number 2, just by pure biomass itself. And again, as you're thinking about sets of technologies and as you disrupt that ecosystem, what does that do to the overall, the context of the climate? Then it's fungi, archaea, protists. So by biomass, there are more number of protists than there are humans on this planet, just by mass alone. And then in that zone, you can see arthropods. One thing to think about is the human biomass is roughly, it's smaller than the livestock biomass. This is worth comparing. If you were to compare this biomass to the biomass of carbon, for example, that we emit. Does anybody know the annual carbon emitted, for example? So I just did that quick Google, and that number is around 40 gigaton for 2019. And I go back to that plant number. That's around 450 gigatons. So that's a significant portion of, you just think about it, like it's much larger when we are talking about the total mass of humans per se, when you're really thinking about it. I mean, it's half of the context of just the amount of, and then again, all of this is cycled. So it's a complex kind of a thing to think about, because just because we emit it doesn't mean it accumulates there. A significant portion of it is removed by the ocean and turned back into living biomass as well. But just that number is actually quite remarkable. And one of the things once we know how much of the biological mass is, there was enough data that was already present in terms of just the Industrial Revolution, and you can really see roughly around 2020 is that crossover point, except the problem is that much of this is exponential. This can't stay exponential in the ways that we are going. That would just be absolutely disastrous. Another way of looking at it that I really like in this data is we all as a society make enough mass in plastic, concrete, and everything, which is equal to our mass per week for all of us. So for every human being, as a society, we are making that much stuff per unit person. And because it's so tied to population and need, it actually also grows as the population grows. So my intuition is that if there was certain kind of a cap on a population, there might be a certain cap there. It's not going to keep going. But on the other hand, that is still a significant amount. And this is just gives you a good magnitude in terms of thinking about consumption. Of course, not everything that we make is made equal, because you can think about certain sets of infrastructure. So this is the equivalent of why these numbers match, is we have made enough buildings as there are trees on this planet by biomass alone. And then the other example for that is there is twice as much plastic on the planet than the mass of all animals combined. So that gives you another perspective of why we have this problem to begin with. And somebody could have done these calculations. I think the irony of all of this is there is no rocket science in all of this. It's just good number crunching. We had this capability. We could have done this 50 years ago and anticipated and thought about the kinds of trends that might appear. And this is why I want you to do these calculations, and we're spending so much time. You can actually uncover new knowledge primarily by aggregating these sets of resources. You can uncover new ways of thinking. You can uncover new ways of teaching. And all of this is pencil and paper. It doesn't get more frugal than that. But in one sense, once I read this paper, it was a really different way of just thinking about the amount of stuff that we make. And when you're thinking about solutions that also involve materials, you have to really be thinking about, are you contributing to these other problems as well as you try to tackle and solve one problem, which we have seen when Anton talks about a project that we work on in the lab that becomes very relevant. Okay, so let's, how are we doing on time? Okay, we still have some time. Let's do some more calculations. I was going to talk about the oceans, but I think maybe I'm going to skip this a little bit. Let me just throw some numbers at you just to balance this scenario of thinking about what really happens in the ocean. It's incredibly important when you're thinking about these climate types of contexts to include the ocean side of the equation. Otherwise, most of the planetary, the terrestrial stuff is balanced, and we often ignore. I mean, the obvious one, for example, is half of the oxygen that's made on the planet is made in the ocean. So you can back calculate and think about this in the context of the biomass and the algae and the diatoms that created. Another very important aspect of this calculation is you can think about the 20 billion metric ton that I had mentioned, 40 that I had mentioned, 20 is reabsorbed by the ocean. So it immediately is taken out of the equation because of the biology of the life on the planet in terms of just the planktonic life. And the thing that I find this to be incredibly scary is because this is what we don't understand, and there's lots of ideas floating around on carbon sequestration and frugal ways of removing carbon per unit dollars. Some of them involve messing up with this pump. If somebody was to switch off this pump and something happens to this absorption cycle, our CO2 number jumps from 400 to 600 parts per million in overnight, because we are just not removing. And I think one of the challenges around this is we don't really understand the basic biology of this pump. But it's very important when you're thinking about the context of the carbon, and the way this pump works is essentially deciphered. Sometimes there is a picture that you can find that truly communicates the context of the problem that you're trying to study. I love this picture because this, to me, is the oldest carbon sequestration technology. So what you're looking at are these single cells. They are less than 5 microns, but they die, and when they die, they sink, and they take carbon with them. And these mountains, these are called mountains of Dovers, are literally only, this is chalk, and they're only made of single cells that are 5 microns big. And this is all across the coast of UK, and this is the pump. Coccolithophores consists maybe around 40% of all of that carbon capture that I was talking about in terms of the 50% of the total anthropogenic carbon that's made. And this is another aspect of sometimes thinking about that the small can add up to be very big, and hence if you make your assumptions right or wrong, it can completely change the answer. Like if we had just ignored this one species, you would not be able to understand. And that is very clearly indicated in this beautiful paper that's cited in the IPCC reports. You know, we read all these IPCC reports and we think everything is fine. And I love, this is a very well-reputed paper. It's not, I love the title of that paper, Assessing the Apparent Imbalance Between Geochemical and Biochemical Indicators of Meso and Bathypelagic Biological Activity, what the dash is wrong with present calculations of carbon budget. And what they're trying to allude towards this idea is that when you do the same calculation through one way, which is including the biology, which is the ocean, and you do the exact same calculation through the atmospheric side, knowing that some carbon is disappearing from the ocean, they don't add up. So how is it that at this moment even we don't have a good estimate? So you calculate the same thing, 2 different methods, and there is a big gap. So, and again, just identifying that gap is actually a very valuable part of the process, because you want to be able to find these gaps. If you find a gap like this, you know that there is something interesting in your calculations. Though this is one more motivation in terms of thinking about for us to essentially do these multiple ways. Okay, so just a little bit of a comment on sources of data and trustworthy sources of data. This is something that's incredibly important, and I think by aggregating trustworthy sources of data, you also help others that might be trying to do something like this. So I think I'm going to go through this very fast. How many of you, when COVID hit, actually played with COVID data? Did you used to check for countries, like check your hometown is doing well or not? It's quite interesting. And I think one of the things that you could do is, this is the one generation as a society that I kind of felt that our life depended on this data in a very visceral way. I would check the numbers. I still check the numbers in San Francisco to see, oh, should my kids be wearing masks today or not? I think we wouldn't be talking about something like this on an average year or in a normal time. So in some sense, data has played a huge role. But how is it that when we have had the sets of data, the policies still have not met the data? And sometimes, how is it that data gets weaponized in many ways, where you say the total number of deaths? I don't know if you read the numbers that came out of Africa, that 1/3 of all people have had COVID, which is so scary to think about. But the deaths don't add up. And you say that, oh, wait a second, should we prioritize vaccination across Africa? And the answer is yes. If you look at this in terms of thinking about the way that there was nothing new, COVID was still spreading, and it just was not being reported in the same way that here every 2 deaths or 3 deaths would get reported, and hence it shifts the sets of priorities because you say, oh, it's never a problem, young population, you can write it off. So data can get weaponized, and I think it's very valuable to be thinking about in this context of getting the context right. Even if the data sources are true, if you miss the context, you actually will completely misrepresent or misinterpret the goals. So a few sets of sites that I really like. One is Our World in Data. That was started by Max Rosser. It's, everybody cites them. You have all played with their maps. They have these beautiful videos. And one of the things that I find interesting about this, that when Max started the site, in 2011, for several years, he was the single person behind Our World in Data. And then, of course, it took multiple years for him to even find funding. And at this point, it's a team. It's still a small enough, 10 to 15 team. More than half the articles are still written by Max. But, individuals matter. And I think this is the other aspect of this, is that when you do create the kinds of sets of resources, this then became the primary, at least the visualization engine for a lot of data that got presented around the time of COVID. I was going to go through some of these sites, but I don't know if there is a way for me to show that on the screen. So one thing you could just all do is just open up your laptops and just type in Our World in Data, and then you could choose a subject of if you go to the left corner, I just want you to be familiar with this, because we will be using this in the assignment for the type of a problem that you care about or what you're trying to solve. So again, do the same exercise that we did with the cell. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but maybe one of you can pop out a chart that you find interesting, and then you can talk about why you opened it. So if you go in the left corner, it's divided by education, maternal health, child mortality, anything that you care about, and then you can dig in a plot that surprises you. Something that when you opened it, before reading about it, you would not have anticipated it to be that way. And then you can just talk about it to see if somebody found something that's puzzling or of interest. I often find that the moment I just start anything that I open, it breaks my intuition very quickly, because it's very difficult to think about both these trends, but also trends as a function of time. So I'm curious, does anybody wants to share something that they're looking at and what they find surprising? Everybody found the way that the data is organized, right? You all found the left bar there, so if you go to the top, yeah, I think all of you are on the... so one way that I like to look at it is if you go to the Our World in Data and then by topic, and then you can... It's much more organized, because otherwise they just come as blogs. So if you go in here by topic, and then it's just much more streamlined. So the topic area is, right up on top. So one thing that we will definitely do in this week is spend lots of time on this site, and you can also get into the habit of, once you find a plot, make sure you always read where the reference or the source came from, because most likely what you're interested in is not going to be plotted so nicely and organized in this way. By that time that problem has already been very well researched. But you need to find the references and the resources and get into the habit of seeing, there was this type of a reference or a resource that was accessible, and hence they were able to even, really develop this. This structure is much more for representing the data rather than, they don't collect their own data at all. Much of that data really is aggregated, and so what you're more interested in is find the kinds of resources. There's a couple other places that this is aggregated. This is a nice one that I like. This is from the Global Sustainability Goals called the Sdg Tracker. This is also built by the same group. But you could say that I'm interested in a specific topic area like clean water and sanitation, and then you can find a whole bunch of plots that are associated with how are we doing on the sustainability goals for the 2030, for example. There's a couple other visualizations. You can look through them from the history. I'll post this online. I think this is one of the data depository for WHO. This is a really fun one because there is original new data in here. So this is not just, I'll post these slides so you guys don't have to write this. This is in a scenario where it's coming from the governments and it is new data that's not aggregated. There is GHDX, another global health data exchange. There's a tremendous sort of resources and things around global health. I would argue that we don't have enough on the context of conservation. The one I know is from London, which is the London Zoological Society, or ZSI. They have an index of all species, their abundance, their status, endangered status. You can think a little bit about, of course, on the climate side, the IPCC reports are the first place to start because they're already an aggregating service. So I think, with what we'll end up doing is finding a couple of these threads in terms of thinking about the problems that you care about. So let's jump into when you cannot look something up. And I think we already discussed that framework a little bit here, but just two comments that I'll mention, which is also just the history of Fermi and some of the tricks and some of the famous examples. So first of all, there is actually an entire class on the topic that I'm covering today. This really, in my mind, is something that you practice, but there is a class called Back of the Envelope Physics. It's really focused on physics, and so I think one thing that would be valuable is if you're interested in digging more in this, find that physics literature and you can read it, but then you really have to apply that to problems like this. This exists less in terms of how quantitatively we think about solutions. So who was Fermi? And I'm assuming, how many of you have heard of the Fermi piano tuner problem? So the problem was, Fermi is a physicist from a nuclear physics, played a big role in the atomic bomb, but the problem that he used to always ask as a way to introduce this idea is estimate the number of piano tuners in Chicago. And you can, without reading his solution, you can think about it. You might say, oh, what a trivial or an unimportant question. But what you realize is by posing an abstract question, it really shows his process. And I mean, that's why Fermi's problems are named after him, because he would do this for every possible thing you can come up with. And then it really taught people how to do this. So the example for this one was, from Chicago, the population. You can start by an average family. Then you can say if they contain 4 people, that's already 750,000 families. If you start assuming that from the trends in Chicago, and this is a big assumption, you could make a huge mistake here, but this is a cultural assumption. You could back it by multiple different sources. You could see how many advertisements of pianos go out, how many piano shops were there. But the estimate there was if 1 in 5 families owns a piano, then you calculate how many times a piano gets serviced. If the person was working this much amount of time, he kind of comes back to this number of 150 piano tuners. And actually somebody checked that number, and at that time that number was very close. And of course, this is a fun problem. He actually also did this for some very serious problem. And this is essentially the secret documents that got released after a lot of the nuclear-related documentation has now been publicly released. He's also known for estimating the size of the Trinity bomb. The Trinity bomb was the very first nuclear explosion that went well. It was a test site. And the way he did this is, I'm not going to go into this, but I'll post this, but kind of the joke around this is that when a bomb explodes, there is a pressure wave that travels, and he literally was standing there, and he knew that there will be a certain set of a pressure, and you can calculate energy from pressure and the volume expansion, P times delta V, and volume he calculated by sprinkling literally pieces of paper where he was standing, and he saw in a normal condition the pieces of paper will fall like this, like literally bits of papers, and when the bomb exploded he also sprinkled pieces of paper. because this is top secret information, so sometimes this is not released, and just the shift that you saw in that sprinkled pieces of paper, he would put that in as the delta V based on the size of that kind of a circle around an explosion, and out comes a number. I think he estimated something like 10 kilotons, and the actual number was somewhere around 20 kilotons. And so I think one of the things that ends up happening with these types of problems is to be able to get to the average. And here there is a certain set of a thinking that you have to apply, because this is a physical process. So it's not so trivial these are the things that require a lot of practice to get right. So it's not just a data aggregation exercise. And I would argue even here, like if you call and talk about water shortage, and then you could understand and estimate certain things about the physical context of the temperature, and you could understand how many water resources are being lost because of evaporation, which is a physical context and a physical process. You could apply that, because many countries for drought management actually cover their water sources with floating plastic balls. And you could estimate how much water do we just lose because of evaporation. So keeping this in mind in the context of, although these problems might look really socially inclined, and unless somebody gives you the exact data, that's not the case. You will never get the exact data you need. I think I am really curating, even in my head, the types of ideas that I'm picking to discuss. It's very difficult, although it seems trivial, it's actually quite a difficult exercise. The two books that I like on that front are, one is Guesstimation. This is an okay book, but this one is one of my favorite books. It's called Street Fighting Mathematics, and it's about educated guessing. This is by a friend of mine, Sanjay Mahajan. And one of the things about this is it doesn't just talk about the estimates, it also talks about simplifications. And these are fairly small books. It's the equivalent in my mind for mathematics, as is the book in which we all get for when we start writing English, the Elements of Style. Do you all know that thin book? No? Anyway, yeah, just another tiny book to keep in mind as a source to look for when you're thinking a little bit about wanting to dive in a little bit deeper. Okay, so I think maybe one thread that we'll do is let's just spend a few more minutes discussing certain. Actually, no, let me just do the social context of this for a second. What to be worried about. I think one thing to remember is there's another fantastic book that came out around the time of COVID. It's called Whole Numbers and Half Truths. This is really 10 insights that Rukmini is an author out of Mumbai around data that was publicly available about India, and she was able for 10 chapters or about 10 specific issues. Most of them are social issues. And the interesting thing is, this is the one book that I've read parts of it where I really realized the value of context. And what she's trying to highlight in most of the book is really this notion that governments publish all kinds of data. And then you could say, oh, I don't trust this data, or you have to be much more nuanced about it. And sometimes even if the data is correct, the truth that it's trying to tell is not. Because one example that I like about this is there is data that she pulled out, which is it's a chapter called Eat, Pray, Enjoy, Love, and Marry: How India Lives Its Life. And one of the most common statistics and number that's quoted in India is the number of interreligious and intercaste marriages are predictably low. And that's the number to think about, okay, people prefer to only get married with certain sets of religious context. But then when she started digging in, and when you do the sets of interview, because she was trained as a journalist, what she realized is, and she spoke to somebody, and it's a paragraph in the book, somebody said that's data about marriage, madam. He said, not about love. I think if you ask the data of how people fell in love, that would completely change the demographics. And this is this context of how you might want to use that data. And this is just one of many examples in this book. And I think one thing to be cautious of and thinking about in this respect is the sets of statistics that come in, you really have to also account for the context. Who collected it? what was the process of collecting that type of a data? What were the sets of incentives that somebody might have around collecting that data? If you're thinking about the health context, you might realize many healthcare systems that monitor themselves have a very strong incentive to look good. And so although they're collecting the data, that the way that it might be presented, there might be a set of a bias. There might be an unconscious bias associated with it. When you have independent data collections, it's also very valuable. I think this is done quite a lot when you think about the mortality indexes, how people measure how many people die per day. There's a huge set of variation associated by policies between different countries, different ways of quantifying it. So it would be very valuable when you're choosing a problem that don't just cite a data source. Try to put yourself in the shoe in terms of thinking about, do I have a gut feeling that I trust this data? And there might be something else going on in the interpretation. Not putting blame on somebody, because it's the best we can do. Sometimes there are sets of problems that you will all be dealing with in which it would be very difficult to have found that data. So we are very happy to even find something, but at that same time, it might take you astray in certain sets of ways. And I think this is the best example that I know of being very critical of your data. Think of you being a detective in this process rather than just the fact that you are a number cruncher. So the idea about by the numbers is that you are applying the same process of science that you would apply to this interpretation, rather than an accountant where you just say, I accounted for this. And this is why you should question every number that comes out, because a number might pop out that makes no sense. Then you believe in your intuition per se and use that intuition in a manner to either qualify or disqualify that data. I'm going to stop here. I think one thing that we will do is we will pick up some ideas around data visualization when we meet in the lab session itself. But one thread that would be very valuable is if everybody could choose a problem that you like. You can post the problem that you're trying to solve on Discord and have other people comment and give you ideas, kind of what we did with Michael's problem that he had mentioned. But what I would love to see is for everybody to have a quick Notion page where you do some of these numbers. And I think for the projects, this will be a requirement to convince that, you should convince your teammates this way, you should convince funding organizations this way. Currently, there is this notion of impact investment, where even any solution that works, you have to measure whether what you're doing is worth the dollar that you are trying to ask somebody else to invest in it. So that would be the assignment, and I think the goal of these assignments is we're all reading it to help each other. I'm not evaluating them in any formal way itself, but that should not be the reason to not try it. So I think we'll stop there, and then I'm going to hang around for a little bit if people have questions.